You'll wear my husband's name, Mr. Cole. Nothing more.
Hours earlier, Jedediah entered Amarillo Springs carrying his 3-year-old daughter, too cold to cry, and only $2.
You still owe $4, Cole. I can't extend more credit.
Margaret watched him leave upright, a legal notice clenched in her hand. A man claiming to be her late husband's brother had come for her ranch.
This isn't charity. It's a business proposition.
She needed an heir. He needed shelter and security for Ruth. Accepting meant wearing another man's name before a town ready to judge him. Then, the claimant appeared outside the courthouse and challenged everything. Before a court decided who belonged to the Ashcroft family, returned to Jedediah's 11-mile winter walk. The winter of 1888 settled hard over the Texas Panhandle by the second week of December, the wind off the caprock carrying a cold that cut through wool as easily as it cut through canvas and left even the town's hardiest ranchers hurrying between buildings rather than lingering outdoors any longer than absolutely necessary. Jedediah Cole walked into the town of Amarillo Springs with his daughter Ruth riding on his hip, 3 years old and quiet with the particular stillness of a child too cold to properly cry about it, both of them having covered 11 miles since their wagon's rear axle finally splintered beyond any roadside repair. He had $2 remaining and a debt at the feed store he had no way to settle before spring. He did not yet know that the woman watching him from across the street, dressed in fine black mourning silk, despite 3 years having passed since her husband's death, would offer him something so strange and so specific that he would spend the following hour simply trying to understand whether he had properly heard her correctly. Margaret Ashcroft stood outside the land office with a legal notice clutched in one gloved hand, and something in the sight of a father carrying his daughter through bitter cold settled a decision in her mind that had been forming uncertainly for the better part of a difficult week. Jedediah Cole had once managed a modest cattle operation of his own, 40 head, and a small house he had built with his own hands the year he married his wife Sarah. 2 years of drought had killed the grass first, then the cattle, and finally the bank had taken the property itself, leaving Jedediah with nothing beyond a wagon, a daughter, and grief he had not yet properly finished carrying. Sarah had died the previous winter, a fever taking her within days, and Jedediah had buried her himself beneath a lone mesquite because he could not afford to pay another man for the labor. Since then, he had drifted across the Panhandle, taking whatever day labor presented itself, his circumstances growing more desperate with each passing month. Margaret Ashcroft had inherited the largest ranch in 3 counties from her late husband Cornelius, a man who had built the Ashcroft spread from a single small homestead into the most prosperous cattle operation in the Panhandle before a riding accident took him 3 years earlier. His horse, stumbling in a prairie dog hole at full gallop and breaking his neck instantly on ground he had ridden 1,000 times before without incident. She was 38 years old, and she had spent those 3 years running the operation alone with a stubborn, careful competence that had earned her grudging respect from every rancher in the territory, learning cattle markets and land management with the same diligence she had once applied to supporting Cornelius's own ambitious plans for the ranch's expansion. The grand house she occupied by herself had grown considerably quieter with each passing season, 11 years of marriage having never produced the children she and Cornelius had both quietly hoped for. A private grief she carried beneath her composed public presence, rarely speaking of it even to the few friends who might have offered genuine comfort had she allowed herself to properly ask for it. Jedediah reached the feed store's counter with Ruth still balanced on his hip, and the proprietor, a narrow, unsympathetic man named Silas Pryor, looked up from his ledger with the flat expression of someone who had already decided the answer before hearing the question. "You still owe $4 from last month, Cole," Pryor said. "I can't extend further credit with winter setting in and my own family to feed." Jedediah's jaw tightened, though his voice remained level. "I'm not asking for credit, Mr. Pryor," he said. "I have $2 here for feed and flour, whatever that'll properly cover. I'll settle the rest as soon as I've found steady work." Pryor's expression didn't soften. $2 won't cover what your family needs through a panhandle winter, Cole, and we both know it. Jedediah's shoulders dropped with the particular exhaustion of a man who had heard variations of this exchange in every town along his difficult road, and he turned toward the door, murmuring an apology to Ruth that she was too cold to properly register. It was the sight of his straight back despite the refusal that finally moved Margaret Ashcroft through the feed store's door. "Mr. Pryor," she said, and the storekeeper's entire posture shifted the instant he recognized her voice. "Mrs. Ashcroft," he said, straightening quickly. "I didn't see you come in." Margaret did not look at him directly. She kept her attention on Jedediah, who had stopped near the door, watching her with the wary confusion of a man who had learned not to trust sudden intervention from strangers. "Give this man whatever his family requires through the winter," Margaret said, "and place it on my account along with clearing whatever debt he already carries." Pryor's mouth opened to protest, but Margaret continued before he could properly form the objection. "I wasn't asking your opinion on the matter, Mr. Pryor." Jedediah stepped forward, alarm plain across his exhausted face. "Ma'am, I can't accept that," he said. "I don't take charity, whatever my present circumstances suggest." Margaret turned to face him fully, something private and calculating crossing behind her composed expression, before she spoke again. "This isn't charity I'm offering, Mr. Cole," she said. "It's the beginning of a business proposition, and I'd be obliged if you'd hear the whole of it before refusing anything further." They spoke properly that same afternoon in Margaret's own carriage. Ruth settled with warm blankets and bread, while the adults discussed matters considerably more serious than feed store credit. "I received notice this morning that a man claiming to be my husband's long-lost younger brother has arrived in the territory," Margaret explained, holding up the legal document that had prompted her entire difficult morning. Cornelius spoke of a brother only twice in 11 years of marriage, a boy who ran off from their family's Missouri farm as a teenager and was never heard from again. This man claims to be that brother, returned now to claim inheritance rights to the Ashcroft Ranch on the grounds that Cornelius died without children, and Texas law regarding a childless widow's claim against a deceased husband's surviving blood relatives remains considerably less settled than I would prefer. Jedediah listened with genuine confusion. "I don't understand what any of this has to do with me, ma'am," he said. Margaret's chin lifted, the same firm gesture that had silenced Silas Pryor's objections. "You'll wear my husband's name, Mr. Cole," she said, "nothing more. A legal adoption into the Ashcroft family, formally recorded, establishing you and your daughter as Cornelius's chosen heirs through proper territorial procedure. It strengthens my position against this claimant considerably, demonstrating the family line continues through deliberate choice rather than leaving the matter entirely open to a stranger's convenient timing. In exchange, you'll have steady work managing portions of the ranch, a home and security for your daughter that your current circumstances plainly cannot provide." Jedediah stared at her, utterly unable to process what he had just heard. "You want me to take your husband's name," he repeated slowly, "and become his adopted heir, essentially, without either of us having any actual blood relation to the man." Margaret held his gaze steadily. "Precisely that," she said. "Not a marriage, Mr. Cole. Nothing improper or presumptuous. Simply a legal recognition that Cornelius's chosen family continues through the deliberate provision he might have made had circumstances allowed it, formalized now, to protect what he built from a stranger's opportunistic claim." Jedediah's pride, worn thin by months of desperate wandering, rose sharply despite the offer's obvious practicality. "I don't take charity, ma'am, however you've dressed the offer," he said, "and I won't have this county whispering I traded my daughter's comfort for a stranger's convenient legal maneuvering." Margaret's expression firmed further. "Then don't think of it as charity," she said. "Think of it as two people the frontier has tested rather severely, finding mutual advantage in an arrangement neither of us would have chosen under easier circumstances. I need a legitimate heir this claimant cannot easily contest. You need considerably more than $2 can currently provide your daughter. Cornelius would have wanted this ranch protected by whatever legal means proved necessary, and I find myself considerably less concerned with pride, mine or yours, than with ensuring 11 years of his work doesn't simply transfer to a man who abandoned his own family decades before ever hearing Cornelius had died. Jedediah looked down at Ruth, sleeping now against the carriage's warm blankets, and something in his exhausted resolve finally allowed itself to bend. "For her," he said quietly. "I'll consider this for her sake, ma'am, not my own comfort." Margaret nodded, businesslike, though something more private passed behind her composed expression. "Then we understand each other," she said. "We'll ride for the territorial land office in the morning to begin the formal adoption proceedings. There's a house on the property that's sat empty since my last foreman retired. It's modest, but sound, and considerably warmer than whatever arrangement has had you walking 11 miles through December cold." The formal proceedings, when they took place the following week before a territorial judge in Amarillo Springs, established Jedediah and Ruth Cole as legally recognized members of the Ashcroft family, Jedediah now carrying the Ashcroft name alongside his own, a legal heir to whatever claim the mysterious brother might attempt to press. Outside the courthouse afterward, a man in a fine gray coat watched the proceedings' conclusion with visible displeasure, his expression souring considerably at the sight of Margaret's newly formalized arrangement. His name was Bartholomew Ashcroft, or so he claimed, and he approached Margaret directly as she descended the courthouse steps. "Convenient timing, Mrs. Ashcroft," he said, his voice carrying easily across the quiet street. "A stranger adopted into the family mere days after my own claim reached your attention. I wonder how closely the territorial court will examine such suspicious circumstances." Margaret did not blink. "My family doesn't concern itself with the opinions of men who abandon their blood relatives for 30 years and then arrive expecting inheritance the moment those relatives die," she said. Jedediah said nothing at all, simply meeting Bartholomew's gaze with a stillness that made the man's confident posture falter slightly at the edges. The house on the Ashcroft property, when Jedediah and Ruth moved into it that same week, smelled of cedar and old wood smoke, and Ruth claimed the small second bedroom with a solemnity suggesting she understood, in her own quiet way, exactly how much had changed for both of them. There was real food that evening, more than either had managed in longer than Jedediah cared to properly measure, and he watched his daughter eat without the careful rationing she'd grown accustomed to, her small shoulders finally dropping from around her ears. By the second morning, Ruth had already claimed a particular spot near the kitchen window as her own, watching the ranch hands move cattle through the frost-covered pasture with an attention that suggested she found the whole operation genuinely fascinating rather than merely unfamiliar. Jedediah threw himself into managing the ranch's western pastures with the same careful discipline he'd once brought to his own failed operation, and within a month, his knowledge of cattle and grazing rotation had proven genuinely valuable to an operation that had run somewhat inefficiently under hired management alone. His pride flared once in mid-January, when Margaret arranged for a proper set of winter tack to be delivered to his workshop without first consulting him, intending the gesture as simple practicality, but which Jedediah initially received as unwelcome charity dressed up as ranch necessity. "I can make do with what the previous foreman left behind, Mrs. Ashcroft," he said, more sharply than he'd intended when she rode out to see the matter properly settled. Margaret studied him a long moment before responding, her own composure steady despite his tone. "I don't doubt that you can," she said, "but proper equipment means considerably fewer accidents in weather this severe, and I'd rather not watch you injure yourself proving a point about pride that neither of us particularly needs, proven twice in one winter. Accept the tack, Mr. Cole. Consider it simple ranch management rather than charity, because that's genuinely all it is." Jedediah stood there a long moment, feeling the sting of his own overcorrected pride, before finally nodding once, gruffly, and thanking her properly. Margaret found herself visiting the smaller house most evenings, first under the excuse of reviewing the western pasture's improving productivity, though the truth ran considerably deeper with every visit that passed. She brought Ruth small wooden toys and sat with her by the hearth, while Jedediah finished his evening rounds, discovering in herself a warmth toward the girl that startled her after 11 childless years of marriage and 3 more of solitary grief. One evening, she found a small carved wooden calf resting on the porch rail, no note attached, the wood still faintly warm from the whittling knife, and she knew exactly whose hands had made it, keeping it in her coat pocket for several days before finding the words to properly thank him. Word of the arrangement spread through Amarillo Springs exactly as Jedediah had feared it might. Women at the Mercantile whispered that the widow Ashcroft had legally adopted a penniless stranger she'd found refused credit at the feed store, that grief and isolation had clearly overtaken her usually sound judgment, that a man with nothing to his name would surely exploit an arrangement this generous before the year properly turned. Jedediah heard a version of this himself one afternoon at the Mercantile counter, 2 ranchers exchanging a knowing look the moment he mentioned Margaret's name in an ordinary business matter, and he left without purchasing what he'd come for, his jaw tight with a shame he'd thought himself long past feeling. It was Margaret's longtime foreman, a weathered man named Otis Bramwell, who had worked the Ashcroft spread since before Cornelius's death, who finally spoke plainly in Jedediah's defense one evening at the Mercantile counter. "I've watched that man improve this ranch's western pastures more in 1 month than the last hired manager achieved in 3 years, Otis said. "Whatever this county wants to whisper about hasty adoptions and convenient timing, I've never once seen Cole take advantage of anything Margaret Ashcroft has offered him, and I've watched considerably closer than most of you gossiping at this counter." Margaret heard the rest of the whispers herself and let them slide past her like rain off an oiled coat, though the true danger sharpened considerably when Bartholomew Ashcroft's lawyer filed formal papers contesting the legitimacy of Jedediah's adoption. Not every week passed smoothly. In January, Bartholomew Ashcroft's lawyer filed formal papers contesting the legitimacy of Jedediah's adoption, arguing before the territorial court that the arrangement had been assembled too rapidly and too conveniently to represent genuine family intention, rather than a transparent legal maneuver designed purely to defeat his client's legitimate claim. The court scheduled a formal hearing for early March to examine the adoption's validity, and Margaret spent the following weeks gathering evidence of Jedediah's genuine character and the arrangement's practical merit, determined the hearing would demonstrate considerably more substance than Bartholomew's lawyer hoped to expose. She reviewed Cornelius's private papers late into many evenings, searching for anything that might definitively settle the question of Bartholomew's true identity. And Jedediah often sat with her through these long hours, offering steady company through work that clearly cost her considerable private grief to properly undertake, reopening correspondence and memories she had left carefully undisturbed since Cornelius's death 3 years earlier. Edor. "If the court rules the adoption invalid," Margaret told Jedediah one evening, reading through her lawyer's careful preparations, "Bartholomew's claim proceeds essentially unopposed, and everything Cornelius built could transfer to a man who genuinely may have no legitimate connection to this family at all." Jedediah considered this carefully. "What proof exists that he's genuinely Cornelius's brother?" he asked. "Precious little beyond his own testimony," Margaret admitted. "A birth record from Missouri that could belong to any number of men, and a convenient story about family estrangement that conveniently cannot be verified through any living witness." She was quiet a moment, watching the fire. "Tell me about Sarah," she said softly, "if you're willing to." Jedediah stared into the flames a long while before answering. "She had a way of finding hope in circumstances that offered precious little of it," he said. "I keep thinking if I'd managed the ranch more carefully during the drought, diversified against exactly the kind of loss that eventually took everything, she might still be here instead of buried under a mesquite tree with nothing but my own hands for a proper service." Margaret's eyes filled with a grief of her own, carefully guarded across 11 years of marriage and 3 more of solitary mourning. "Cornelius and I tried for children the entire length of our marriage," she said quietly. "It never happened, and after he died, I told myself this ranch would simply have to be legacy enough, that protecting what he built was the only inheritance I had left to properly manage." She looked at him directly. "Watching you and Ruth these past weeks, I've come to understand I wasn't protecting his legacy at all. I was simply avoiding admitting how thoroughly I'd resigned myself to an empty house. Jedediah reached across and took her hand. Then perhaps, he said, we ought to face whatever Bartholomew intends to press together, rather than either of us facing this alone. We are more than halfway through Margaret and Jedediah's story now, and if a widow's unusual offer to share her husband's name has stirred something in you, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss the next tale from this same forgotten stretch of the Texas frontier. What do you think the territorial court will decide about Bartholomew's claim when the hearing finally arrives in March? Tell us in the comments whether you believe he's genuinely who he claims to be. Now, back to Amarillo Springs, where the county was already gathering to watch a family's legitimacy decided in open court. The March hearing drew considerable attention throughout the Panhandle, half the county gathering in the Amarillo Springs courthouse to witness proceedings that would determine both a fortune's rightful heir and the legitimacy of Margaret's unusual arrangement. Wooden benches had been arranged before the judge's platform, and Jedediah sat near the front with Ruth settled quietly beside him, the girl too young to fully understand the stakes, but old enough to sense the weight settled over the entire courtroom. Bartholomew's lawyer presented his case first, describing the family estrangement, the birth record, and painting Jedediah's adoption as a transparent legal maneuver assembled specifically to defeat a legitimate blood claim. When Margaret's turn came, she presented Jedediah's careful management of the ranch's western pastures, testimony from her own ranch hands describing his genuine integration into the family's daily operations, and finally, a detail her own careful investigation had uncovered that Bartholomew's lawyer had clearly hoped would remain buried. Cornelius corresponded with his mother in Missouri until her death 8 years ago, Margaret told the court. In every letter I've reviewed from that correspondence, preserved among Cornelius's private papers, he mentions his younger brother exactly twice, both times expressing genuine grief that the boy had died of typhoid fever 3 years after running away. A death Cornelius's own mother confirmed to him through a Missouri physician's letter she'd kept for decades. Whoever this man is, Your Honor, he is not Cornelius Ashcroft's brother, because that brother has been dead for considerably longer than this claimant has been alive to impersonate him. A stunned silence fell across the crowded courtroom, and the presiding judge studied the physician's letter Margaret submitted with visible mounting gravity. This documentation, properly dated and corroborated by your late husband's own private correspondence, rather thoroughly undermines your opposing party's entire claim, the judge said, addressing Bartholomew directly. I'd strongly advise you to explain, under oath, precisely how you came to possess knowledge of a family history detailed enough to construct this claim, if you are not, in fact, the man you've represented yourself to be. Bartholomew's composure crumbled visibly under the courtroom's collective scrutiny, and within the hour he had confessed the considerably less noble truth that he had worked briefly for the Ashcroft family decades earlier as a hired hand, learned family details during that employment, and constructed his impersonation upon hearing of Cornelius's death and the ranch's substantial value. The judge dismissed his claim entirely and referred the matter to territorial prosecutors for consideration of fraud charges, and Bartholomew left Amarillo Springs within the week, his brief impersonation thoroughly and publicly exposed. Outside the courthouse afterward, Margaret turned to Jedediah, her eyes bright with unshed tears. You didn't have to stand beside me through all of this, she said softly. I could have faced Bartholomew's claim with my lawyers alone. Jedediah looked at her, half the county still murmuring behind them at the dramatic conclusion they'd just witnessed. I've spent months believing I had nothing left worth offering anyone beyond desperate labor, he said. But standing in that courtroom just now, Margaret, I understood I'd been offering something considerably more valuable for weeks already, simply by choosing to stand beside you rather than merely accept your arrangement's practical benefits. Margaret's breath caught, the careful composure she'd maintained through 3 long years of solitary grief finally giving way entirely. I offered you my husband's name, Jedediah, she whispered. Nothing more, I said at the time. I find I want something considerably more honest than that now. I want the man who stood beside me through a stranger's fraudulent claim and helped me finally stop simply protecting Cornelius's memory in favor of building something genuinely new. Jedediah did not answer with words. He crossed the small distance between them, right there on the courthouse steps, and took her hands, and in front of half the assembled county of Amarillo Springs, he kissed her. It was not a kiss of fleeting relief or public spectacle. It was a kiss of promise, of survival, of two people who had each buried someone they loved and had somehow, against every hard frontier, found their way to standing together in broad daylight. The weeks that followed saw the Ashcroft Ranch settle into a steadiness it had not known since Cornelius's death. Jedediah's careful management of the western pastures expanding to encompass considerably more of the operation's daily affairs, and the county's earlier gossip about a hasty adoption dissolving entirely against the visible reality of a family that had proven itself genuine through public trial rather than private convenience. Spring arrived properly across the Texas Panhandle that year, wildflowers blooming first along the very creek where Jedediah had once buried Sarah beneath a lone mesquite tree, and Margaret and Jedediah were married beneath the cottonwoods in a real ceremony, wildflowers gathered by hands from across the county who had once merely whispered about the arrangement, and now came bearing gifts instead, and a fiddle player from the Amarillo Springs Saloon donating his afternoon for free, saying afterward he had never seen two people look at each other quite the way they did that day. Ruth stood as flower girl in a new dress of fine blue wool, and when the ceremony ended, she ran to Margaret without prompting and called her mama for the very first time, small arms thrown around her waist with complete, uncomplicated certainty. Margaret froze entirely still, one hand pressed to her heart, tears spilling freely down her face before she gathered Ruth into her arms, holding her the way she had once dreamed of holding a daughter of her own, in a life that had finally, truly, stopped feeling empty. Years later, travelers passing through Amarillo Springs still spoke of the Ashcroft Ranch, though most had long since stopped distinguishing between Cornelius's original legacy and the family Margaret and Jedediah had built together upon it. Silas Pryor, the feed store proprietor who had once refused Jedediah credit, extended a standing apology and considerable goodwill well before spring properly arrived that first year, and the county's earlier suspicion transformed entirely into genuine respect for a family that had weathered public scandal and emerged from it stronger rather than diminished. Ruth herself, grown into a steady young woman who managed the ranch's breeding records alongside her father, liked to tell visitors that she remembered almost nothing of that bitter December walk into town, only that she had woken warm and fed in a stranger's carriage, and that the stranger had, within a single season, become the only mother she had ever properly known. Above the mantel in the main house, beside the small carved wooden calf worn smooth from years of handling, hung the physician's letter that had once exposed Bartholomew's fraud, framed now beside a photograph taken the spring Ruth first called Margaret Mama. It started with a name offered as protection, Margaret liked to say to anyone who asked about it, and it ended with the truest family I ever thought I'd get to have. Family isn't always about the blood that runs in a person's veins. Sometimes it's about the people who choose each other deliberately, formally, and completely, even when the arrangement begins as pure practical necessity rather than anything resembling love. It's about the hard bargains desperate people strike simply to survive a Texas winter, and the quiet grace that can turn those bargains into something that lasts a lifetime, one honest choice at a time, long after the original necessity that first brought two strangers together has faded into little more than a fondly remembered beginning. If Jedediah and Margaret's story stayed with you, tell us in the comments which moment moved you most, the offer of a shared name, the courtroom exposure of a fraud, or the little girl who called her mama for the very first time. Please like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who still believes a practical arrangement can grow into something genuinely worth having. In our next story, a widowed schoolteacher offers a grieving rancher one impossible winter bargain, and neither of them expects what it will cost to keep it. This is a fictional frontier romance inspired by the real hardships of the American West, and while it touches on grief, poverty, and the fear of losing everything a family has built, Every difficult moment has been told with care and without graphic detail, brought to life here for your entertainment. Until the next trail, keep your fire burning and your heart open to the stranger at your gate. God bless the pioneers, and God bless the hearts that refuse to break.